The year is 1970. Noel Fellows is jailed for a murder he didn't commit. Betrayed by justice, this is the story of one man's despair that finally turns to hope.
It must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning. The phone rang and there was a request, an urgent request for a taxi to take a lady to a hospital because she was starting to have a baby, and the husband was really frantic because he thought the baby was coming at any minute, so I had to take them all the way to Lancaster.
Meanwhile, in the village of Overton, the body of a man was found dead in his own home. Harold Parkinson had been burgled and left severely wounded. Tied up with wire, he died from suffocation while trying to escape. At the time of the murder, Noel Fellows was a young 22-year-old looking for a career. He had tried a job as a policeman, but gave it up after 2 years because he was unhappy with the way they worked. From an office in Preston, Bob Westerdale, formerly crime reporter for the Lancashire Evening Post, picks up the story.
Lancashire police didn't have any suspects, so they started from scratch. Somebody said they'd seen a taxi driver around the area at the time, so some poor officer was obviously detailed to find the name of every taxi driver in a reasonable radius.
And that's really when the nightmare started.
Mr. Parkinson was not only a coin collector, he dabbled in all sorts of weird little areas, and there was a suggestion that he also was a private investigator. All of a sudden they find a notebook in Harold Parkinson's house which bore the name of Noel's mother-in-law.
I was asleep in bed. I'd done a night shift and obviously very tired. The doorbell went and kept going, and nobody seemed to answer it from below.
Noel, undergoing a rather messy divorce at the time, was perhaps a candidate for Mr. Parkinson to be snooping on him. That's what the police thought at the time.
I came downstairs very bleary-eyed and was confronted by 2 detectives who said they wanted to speak to me about the murder of the man in Overton. And then they said they'd like us to go along with them to the memorial hall in Overton, which was their headquarters for this murder inquiry. But I was innocent, so I thought, well, you know, I've got nothing to hide, and that was that. I remember coming through the doors, and as I came through the doors, it's like everybody stopped and looked at me. And this whole room was just full of tables and people, mountains of paperwork, and there were telephones ringing everywhere, and there must have been at least 50 or 60 people in this room. And at that point, I think I really started to get nervous and had a sense of apprehension of why am I here, what am I doing here? And then the detectives weaved me through this room and led me to another room down on the right-hand side. They led me into this room, which was completely different to the main room because this was an empty room except for a table and a few things around. But then I was introduced to the guy who was heading up the investigation, a man called Chief Superintendent John Mounsey, whose claim to fame was he'd arrested and seen convicted the Moors murders, Brady and Hindley, and also the cop killer Sewell, so his fame went before him. For some unknown reason, he started talking about a jacket that my brother lent me for some reason.
I just loaned him the jacket. But what the police did with it is another story.
And I couldn't understand why they were still introducing all these things. And he got more and more aggressive, and I got more and more defensive.
I went down about 11, 12 o'clock at night with my father, and they interrogated us for about 4 hours.
And I'm sort of countering that by saying I thought I was just here just to answer some questions about my statement.
It was like a nightmare, and I'm thinking, well, you know, this is just a story, this isn't real.
I then would thump the table and jump up and shout and then thump the table again, you know, all those sort of intimidating sort of tactics. I got myself in a really emotional state because it'd been like a child, you know, you're backed into a corner and there's a brute in front of you and there's no way out, you're trapped.
There was a detective in the corner there. There was one behind me over here and one behind me over there.
And thumping the table, but really violently thumping the table, trying to intimidate you.
I would say I was about 2 minutes from confessing me and Noel did the murder.
I remember just emotion welling up deep inside me, and tears started to appear, and then I started to cry.
And I just couldn't stop crying and crying. I was sobbing my heart out. And if anything, it was like a torture. You know, you've done it, you're the one.
And when he said, you know, that's it lads, wrap it up, we've got him, I was absolutely stunned, you know. And then he said handcuff him. I thought, what's he handcuffing me for? And it was like you'd been beaten down to such an extent that you just felt absolutely, you know, hopeless, defenceless. You couldn't believe, you know. They led me outside this door, and Joe Mounsey said words to the effect of, let's wrap it up, we've got him. And as I came out, and I was handcuffed as well, I felt absolutely humiliated, because everybody started cheering and clapping, and then I was paraded through all these tables, and people still cheering and clapping, and I just couldn't understand what was going on. And then they led me right through this door at the end at a really slow pace. It seemed like forever to try and get me out of this place. And I could hear the echo of the clapping and the cheering as I walked through the door.
Following his arrest, Noel was taken to the police station in Lancaster, where he was questioned for another 8 or 9 hours, before being charged with the murder of Harold Parkinson.
And I went down to see him in the cell at the police station at Morecambe. And they opened this little trap door. It wasn't a window, or it wasn't this sort of size, it was a tiny little thing. And all I remember seeing was Noel's eyes look black. He hadn't shaved for 2 or 3 days, and he looked terrible. He didn't look like my brother. He looked like death warmed up. And I think, what have they done to him?
Frightened and confused, he was dragged from his cell and taken to the magistrates' court in Lancaster Castle. Dressed only in a pair of overalls and without socks or shoes, the police hurried him up this flight of stairs to stand before the magistrate.
The reason for that is the police had taken all my clothing for forensic tests and didn't have anything to fit me, so that was my first encounter with the courts, dragged up, handcuffed, and just in bare feet on a cold morning, dragged up these steps to the magistrate's court.
Within minutes, Noel was remanded in custody and sent to Risley Remand Centre to await trial for a murder he had not committed.
They took me to reception, and Frog marched me into reception, still handcuffed and chained, whereupon I was ordered to be stripped naked because they were giving me other prison clothes. And then I was locked away in a cubicle, and I was really gripped by fear. I couldn't really understand what was going to happen to me. Then I was ordered into the bath area to take a bath before seeing the doctor, and that's where my worst fears were realised. I was attacked by a number of inmates because somebody told them I was a former policeman, and I went under an awful lot of beating, crying out for help, and they just left me in a heap in the corner. Eventually I was rescued from that and found myself in a hospital wing, and that was my first few hours in prison.
I can still see him now. 29 years later, I can still see his face there through that prison door.
To protect him from the other inmates, Noel spent the next 7 weeks in isolation, waiting for the day of his trial.
But I thought, if I can just survive this, if I can just survive the hostility, that at least when the trial comes along, the truth will emerge. So, this is where they brought me, to Lancaster Castle, the courthouse. This was the morning of the trial. Driven up from Risley, coming to this John o' Gaunt 12th century castle to start the trial. The trial lasted for 4 days, And all I remember, in 4 days, I listened to lie upon lie upon lie. I couldn't believe that one human being would knowingly lie against another human being, considering the seriousness of the charge that was against me. I was the victim of malicious lies. So really it was 4 days of utter despair.
Now his alibi would have been concrete had he been able to produce some taxi records, where he was, which jobs he was doing, and at what time he was doing them. He was quite happy that those would absolve him of any blame. The trouble is, nobody could find them.
The one piece of evidence that seemed to tie Noel to the death of Harold Parkinson was the coat Noel borrowed from his brother. The police had found near the scene of the crime fibres that were similar to those on the coat. Just similar, nothing more.
The questions was, did you lend him the coat? And yes, but. There's no buts, yes or no. And that's all I had to say, yes or no. I think I said 2 words and that was it. And I was led to believe that that's what sent him down.
Before the jury came back, the prison officers had come and put a book and said, your mother sent you this, a picture up, and it was a Bible. And my mother had been a believer from being very young. And so I was brought up in that sort of environment, and I was so desperate, I thought I'll try anything. So I got hold of this Bible and said to God, God, if you're there, you know I haven't done it. Just convince the jury that I haven't done it. Amen, you know. And then when the jury came back and found me guilty, at that point I made that conscious decision. There was no such thing as God. You know, where was this God of justice and love and truth and, you know, all the things I've been taught about as a child? I decided that God was a figment of people's imagination.
Because Harold Parkinson had died of suffocation whilst trying to escape from his bonds, the conviction was changed from murder to manslaughter. Noel Fellows was found guilty and given a 7-year sentence. He was taken to prison, still protesting his innocence, and dragged struggling into a punishment cell.
The idea was they were going to break you, that you'd come to terms with your sentence and you'd conform to the system. And it was a really, really depressing time. Probably the loneliest time I ever remember in my life. Just couldn't come to terms with the fact that I'd been found guilty, and it was just, you just couldn't believe what had happened to me. I just couldn't come to terms, and I went into a really deep spiraling depression. I didn't eat, I didn't want to speak, I just went into myself, and after about 28 days I was released back into the main population of the prison, and only lasted about 3 hours, because as soon as I was put onto the landings, they found out I was an ex-policeman, and again I was threatened and I was beaten, and then found myself in the hospital wing again. And again I was really in this depression, isolated again, and I thought to myself, there's just no point in this, I'm not going to survive 7 years, and I decided that the best thing to do was end it all, and at least then, if I ended it all, there'd be no more pain, there'd be no more thinking about it. And so I tore a sheet up, and there was a conduit on the ceiling, and I made a noose and decided I'd hang myself and end it all. And obviously I was in a very emotional state, very unstable, and stood in a locker, put this noose around my neck and just jumped. Pulled the conduit out the ceiling, so that failed as well. And
after serving 4 years of his 7-year sentence, Noel was released early for good behaviour.
when I was released, it was on a cold January morning. I remember stepping outside the prison doors and thinking, that's it, it's over, I've survived. And looking back at the cold grey prison walls, I thought, this is it, now I can really start my life again. Prison destroyed me as a person. I mean, finally, when I was released from prison, I was a multi-damaged person, but carrying the burden of being convicted for a crime we never committed, and the injustice, the massive injustice of that.
Within 2 months of his release, Noel met a young woman called Coral, whom he later married. Until then, he had not told anyone outside his family what had happened to him.
And because I'd been hurt so much before, I didn't want to be rejected and hurt again, so I thought the best thing to do is to spill the beans, tell Coral exactly where I'm coming from, what's happened in my life, and she'll make her own decision on that.
We were just sitting having coffee one night, and he said he was feeling sort of quite serious about the situation, and he felt he ought to tell me about himself. So he told me that he'd been in prison for a murder that he had never committed. And how did I feel about that?
I mean, I literally just opened my whole life and told her everything. And the significant part was, I said to her, you know, do you believe me? And she said to me, well, if you say you didn't do it, I believe you. And the weight that just sort of lifted from my life was just amazing. The excitement and the knowledge that here was someone for the first time who really believed me was just immense.
And we made a decision right then and there to not tell anybody, because people always say there's no smoke without fire, because they still believe in the system that we have in this country, which is that people don't go to prison for a murder they never committed. I was in a very difficult situation because I'd come from a very violent first marriage, and I felt that the decision I'd made on that moment when Noel said he didn't do it was right, and I trusted him in that. Something in your inner knows that what he said is right. And I would never, ever have put my children in a position where they would have been involved with someone that was of a violent nature after what we'd been through as a family.
It was 10 years later that Bob Westerdale first heard the story of Noel Fellows. At the time, it was rumoured that the police were re-investigating a crime in the little village of Overton.
And when it turned out they were investigating a death of all those years ago, and I just couldn't wait to get my nose in the trough.
And at that time I suffered, I was still suffering from horrendous nightmares.
He used to wake up, and he said he'd been killed in prison again. He used to wake up and he was behind bars. And it was horrendous for him. Night after night he'd be in cold sweats, sweating and dreaming that he'd been in prison.
I remember people used to say to me, you need to go and see a doctor, you need to get help. And I used to say to them, well, but what's a doctor going to prescribe for me for hatred and embitterment and injustice? The only way of switching it off for a while was really when I started to abuse drugs and alcohol, so at least I could get spaced out for a period of time and turn this thing off, this thing called memory and this mind that keeps going 24 hours a day. I suppose I was on some sort of a search in prison when I studied philosophy and logic, you know, and that was the beginning of the journey. Then when I came out of prison and I couldn't control my life, couldn't control my emotions, couldn't control the nightmares, couldn't make it, you know, in everyday living, and I was heading certainly towards an early death.
Meanwhile, the pressure was starting to affect his wife, Coral.
And I felt that the marriage was going to fail. I felt suicidal. I felt that I just couldn't go on, and I actually knelt in my lounge by the couch and said, God, I've just made a mistake here. I obviously can't be what Noel wants me to be. I've tried, and it's just not working. And I felt an absolute failure.
In her despair, Coral turned to God in the only way she knew how. She went to the nearest church. Noel, however, didn't like the idea of her getting involved with Christians.
So I went upstairs and I knelt by the bed, and just like I used to as a child, put my hands together, and I said, God, I'm really sorry I can't come to church anymore. It's really causing upsets in the house because Noel's very cross about it, and so I can't come anymore. But if you want us to come, you're just going to have to bring us both together. Amen. And with that, I just left it.
But God was already at work in Noel's heart. Not long after, in desperation, he agreed to go to church with Coral.
So we went to church, and I saw people, you know, greeting each other and hugging each other, and I felt really insecure in this whole, you know, amongst these people, you know, these believers. And so I'm making all these sort of comments and just telling him to behave himself, and they started singing this hymn or this chorus, I can't remember which. Well, then suddenly my whole body locked up, solid. It's like my whole body went into muscular spasm. I remember thinking to myself, is this it? Am I going? Perhaps I shouldn't have said those things, you know. I'm really in trouble here. And as my body locked up, I just felt this heat come upon me, and just this heat just fed through my body over and over and over. I thought, what on earth's going on? And this heat's pushing through and pushing through. And then it's very hard to verbalise the next bit, except to say, that as this was all gone, it was like some weight, something just lifted from me. And I felt this peace come upon my life. But a peace I'd never known in my life. It's just unexplainable. And it was at that point I just knew it was God. I just knew it was God. I just knew it was God. And I don't really remember how long that lasted, except to say when I sat down, I felt absolutely wonderful. And I went home, I felt wonderful. And I woke up the next morning and I felt wonderful. And then I realised the next morning I woke up, I hadn't had a nightmare, and that God had healed me and taken all these nightmares away. So that was the start of a healing process. It's amazing. It's like God started to work on this mess and started to heal and restore me. And he took things away bit by bit by bit by bit. But it was a process, and it was a process that took years. Forgiveness was a real battle for me. It's just something I didn't want to give up, because that was what I had to hold on to, and so that's what I took to God many, many times.
The things that he found hard in his own character, that he struggled with, just gradually changed over the years, till I'm married to the most amazing man now, and God has blessed me in so many ways just to be his wife.
This is a school, right?
I think from the start, any journalist has got to have a healthy scepticism. You don't go in there and think he's definitely innocent. You don't go in there and think he's definitely guilty. You'd like to find out.
14 years after the event, new evidence from a police supergrass prompted the police to reopen the Noel Fellows case.
And the police supergrass was talking about armed robberies, and this one was a peripheral case.
Raise!
The name of the supergrass was Lenny Pilot. Whilst confessing to the police, he let slip a comment that was going to shatter the entire case against Noel Fellows.
It was just a one-off comment he made about, oh, there was a guy who died up near Morecambe somewhere, and they said some guy did it, and he didn't. I know who did do it. The trouble was that here was a police informer who'd come on the scene all these years later and said, it wasn't him, he's completely in the clear. It was my two buddies, and that's how the whole story began.
I remember kneeling beside the bed, and Coral was the other side of the bed, and Coral said, how do you pray? And I said, well, I don't know how you pray. I think you just put your hands together and you just talk to God. And that very first night I said to God, I've already been vindicated before you. I want to be vindicated before man in my own lifetime. And that was my prayer. Well, ever since I stopped having nightmares, I never dream. It's like it goes night and you wake up the next morning. And so having this dream, I dreamt that two men came to the door. I knocked at the door and I opened the door and they handed me a newspaper. And I remember waking up one morning and telling Coral about this vivid dream I had, and Coral just said to me, well, you know, well, that's nice, you know. And I thought, well, it's strange, I should have a dream like that.
Meanwhile, Bob Westerdale had been searching for Noel and finally caught up with him in the south of England.
So we drove down, plastered along the side of the van's Lancashire Evening Post, most unprofessional, but we found where he lived, and then we found ourselves sat outside there wondering how best to tackle this.
It was about 11 o'clock at night, I seem to recall, and I thought it's very late for somebody to be knocking on the door, so I went up and opened the door, and there were two men at the door.
And I said to him, I'm Bob Westerdale, this is Terry Bromley from the Lancashire Evening Post. We've come to talk to you about the death of Harold Parkinson.
And handed me a newspaper. And as he hands me the newspaper, I recall this dream. It was just like this dream had come into real life. And I said to them, come in. I said, you're messengers from God. And they said, what?
And it absolutely floored me, that, because he didn't know I was coming.
And so that was, you know, the dream. And the newspaper said, the headlines in the newspaper said, police turn up new evidence on old killing. That was my prayer, day in, day out, year in, year out. It's because that, ultimately, I wanted to be set free, and I wanted the world to know that I was innocent.
Noel's joy was so overwhelming that it was infectious. You couldn't help but be thrilled for him.
Following the evidence from Lenny Pilot, Noel was granted the right to appeal against the judgment pronounced against him 14 years earlier.
The Crown, who of course were the agency which convicted him all those years on, stood up and very briefly said that they would not compete this case, which was their way, I suppose, of saying, oh, sorry, mate, we got it wrong.
You can imagine as I walked out of that courtroom, you know, the top judge, the top court in the land, and I was on cloud about 180, because it was finished, it was over, you know, my name had been cleared, I'd been vindicated before man.
They should have said, Keith Noel fellows, we got this wrong, we apologise. We'll never be able to make this up to you, but we just want you to know that we now accept everything that you say is correct. They didn't do that. They just sort of perfunctorily went through it, and he's out the door.
And I remember every part of the media was there, all the people from Fleet Street and BBC and ITV and all the cameras and all the microphones, and sue the police, sue the courts, sue the judiciary, all this stuff that was going on, sue. And it was that moment in time, spontaneously, I said, I've forgiven them. This pregnant silence goes amongst the press, which was a miracle in its own sense. And it was at that moment in time I realised the incredible work God had done in my life. I remember thinking to myself, where did all the hatred go? Where did all the embitterment go? Where did all the rejection go? Where did all the injustice, where did it all go? And yet God had worked all of that out of my life. But more importantly, where did all that unforgiveness go?
He'd been very badly wronged by this country, and it was put right. Belatedly, but it was put right, and he took it in good grace.
When the nightmare was finally over, Noel decided to write a book about his experience.
During the research for the book, we're in his kitchen, on his kitchen table with an enormous amount of documents spread out, and I picked up some stuff and I said to him, Noel, these are these taxi records then? So he went, oh yeah. I said, no, these are the taxi records. And all of a sudden we realised that the information that would have acquitted him had been part of the bundle of documents that was available to that court. So there you have it. The documents that would have absolved him of any blame were there. It was just chosen not to be produced to that jury.
As I'm talking to you now, it's like talking about a stranger. Did that really happen in my life? I don't remember the pain of it. I don't remember all those emotions of it. It's like we've moved on from there.
Noel Fellows and his wife Coral have set up the charity Bridges International, which specialises in helping the families of prisoners, people with addictions and other life-controlling problems.
All we wanted to do is really take this good news, this practical good news of Jesus Christ, to the broken, to the disenfranchised, to the hurting, to all that fabric of society that feel it's been rubbished. Because for crying our lives, you know, really, our lives were rubbished. And God took this rubbish and recycled it and made it into something worthwhile. So in God, nothing is impossible, because we're living testimonies to his intervention and his building and restoring this wasted life into something that's really precious.